Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the workshop on land and asset valuation in involuntary resettlement, co-hosted by MCDF, ADB, AIIB, and NDB. Today, we will focus on the main concepts that form the foundation of this complex field. Each of the 4 sessions today is designed not only to provide knowledge, but also to prepare for the next one, ensuring a good understanding of the challenges and strategies involved in land and asset valuation and how they apply to real-life projects, as you will see from the case study, which is de facto our last 5th session. We have shared the presentations in advance to help you prepare for today's sessions, including the questions that you may have and that we hope to address during the discussions. As Victoria has already mentioned, please put your questions in the chat function and we will pick them up after the individual presentations. However, if there are any unanswered or additional questions, please also remember that we will have a clinic session on day 3. This session will give you all an opportunity to directly engage with our experts regarding any topic-related questions. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to a productive day 1. We will start today with a session led by Zaruhi Hayrapetyan, Senior Safeguard Specialist Social at the Office of Safeguards from ADB, and Ben Elder, a professionally qualified chartered surveyor, the current chair of the International Valuation Standard Council's Advisory Forum and consultant to ADB. Zara and Ben will explore the foundational elements of compensation and replacement costs. And with that, colleagues, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ines. I'm Zara, and Ben is today with me.
Hey, everybody. Great to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Looking forward to a great session.
So we will start with Ben talking about the compensation and replacement cost, main concepts under the policy. So we will start with the concept of compensation, then we will talk about replacement principle, which is fundamental for the policies, and then we will talk about the main 5 elements of the replacement cost. Just let me to ensure I can see everybody. So what is compensation? Did you hear about the mitigation hierarchy? Can you raise the hand, whoever heard about compensation hierarchy? So all mitigation hierarchy, all the policies have a mitigation hierarchy as a baseline, as a fundamental principle. So the project should try to avoid impacts, if it's not possible to minimize the impacts. And then if there are some impacts, to compensate. And while compensating, we should ensure that compensation, assistance, and benefits are designed to enhance or at least to restore livelihoods of all displaced people, and to improve standards of living of displaced poor and vulnerable population. Now, there are 2 main concepts: compensation, which is one-time undertaking, and assistance and benefits, which can continue over time to restore livelihoods and improve income and living standards of affected people. In all MFI finance projects, usually both national laws and regulations and policies applies. And sometimes compensation packages calculated under the national laws could be even higher or lower. So the better options for affected people are considering when compensation packages are designed under the projects financed by multilateral financial institutions. What is due compensation? So the replacement principle is at the center of social safeguards. Affected people should be able to replace what is lost, including assets and incomes. It could be in-kind compensation through replacement of assets. It could be monetary compensation at the replacement cost, but both in-kind compensation and monetary compensation requires valuation to ensure that we are following all the principles of replacement. And let's go to the main replacement principles. First, equivalence. Is it of similar quality, quantity, and purpose, the property that we want to replace? Relevance. is the replaced property useful for displaced person? Is the compensation we propose useful for the displaced person? Choice. Does the displaced person want what we propose? If we are proposing, for example, relocation housing. Availability. Can the asset be purchased, be provided as required based on the compensation we will provide? Alternatives. Are there different ways to reach the replacement of the asset? And all these should be consulted with affected people, discussed with them in order to develop final valuation and compensation approaches under the project. And we will talk more about the importance of consultations with affected people while developing valuation methodologies later. Now, what is full replacement cost? Different policies of different banks have slightly different, may have slightly different language, but almost all are covering the following 5 elements we will talk today. So it's fair market value, transaction costs, interest, transitional and restoration costs, and other applicable payments. If I may ask Ben to join me in explaining the first element of the replacement cost, which is fair market value. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Zara. Yeah, an interesting one, and I'll keep it brief. One of the challenges on today's session is that there's a lot to get through. So fair market value, it's a terminology which is used in valuation, but also in accounting. It's quite often within the valuation just referred to as market value. The fair is dropped, but the fair market value is used in the accounting world, and they're basically the same number, but because they're 2 slightly different names, it does cause some confusion. But it sets a set of hypothetical criteria for measuring value so that 2 values can be compared. There's a very strict definition, which we'll come to later on, but it keeps the process of being able to compare like with like. It is not price, and it is not worth. So a market value, you have to have more than one party who would transact at that level. And what you're identifying are some trigger points for transactions. Not necessarily that transactions will take place. But again, we'll get a chance to move into some of those discussions as we move through. Zara, back to you.
Ben. Thank you, Ben. So second, did I change my screen? So second element is the transaction costs. These are all costs which are associated with the transaction. And this could be different in different contexts. This may include notary services, administrative charges, registration or title fees, expenses associated with updating of land records, inheritances, any other types of documentary requirements. This could be a transfer fee when you are transferring the compensation to the bank account. An interesting type of transaction cost that could be also are the transportation costs associated with the transaction. For example, if people have to take a bus or to be transported to another city, or from the rural areas to a central urban area to sign the contract and to get compensation. So again, this is based on the results of consultations with affected people and proper social impact assessment to understand the context where projects are.
Sorry, if could I just add there that that within the market value definition and with the international standards, transaction costs are not included in the valuation process. That's why it's really important to have them separate.
Thank you, Ben.
Sorry.
Thank you, Ben. And with this, one of the messages that you will hear across all 3 sessions that we will have is that sometimes safeguard specialists and valuation specialists talking about the same concepts are using different words. So it's very important to keep in line, to have a very clear definition of terms, TORs, etc., which we will talk later. But this is just one of the examples. The interest is not applicable to all cases. It comes when there is a gap of time between the payment of compensation that was planned and actual payment of the compensation by the borrowers. Transitional and restoration costs. This is quite an interesting one. And transitional costs involve short-term subsistence allowances to support the displaced persons through a period of income loss due to project or due to the time for physical relocation. Restoration costs refers to necessary improvements on the land or housing to achieve objectives of enhancing the standards and restoring the affected assets. AIIB policy reflects a requirement to consider acceptable minimum community standards of quality and safety. And we will discuss this element now during a short case study. And I will ask Ben also to explain what this concept of modern equivalence in valuation is. Last element of the replacement cost is other applicable payments. It's not, we do not see it in all the projects. And depending on the context, it could be part of the replacement cost or not. In some countries, there are additional payments due to involuntary acquisition of the properties. For example, in Armenia, it's 15% plus to any market value that is considered for the property. So this type of additional applicable payments are covered under the last element of the replacement cost. Now I would like to share with you a very short example, a case study, which will demonstrate that sometimes market value is not enough to compensate and to ensure that asset replacement will take place. So this is a project in Armenia, and an old dormitory had to be affected under the project. It was a old dormitory that was turned into apartments, and affected people, 25 people had titles over that apartments. So each family owned the title, and they had outside facilities such as bathrooms, toilets, and kitchens, quite small apartments from 13 to 35 square meters each. Valuator for project initially used the comparative valuation method. And during the comparative valuation methods, the value of recently sold comparable properties to determine the value of existing property are used. And we will talk about it more next Monday during the session on fundamentals of valuations. So as a result of comparative valuation method, valuator came up with a market value for an apartment. But it turned out during the consultations with affected families and also during preliminary assessment of the real estate market that in the city and in the nearby areas, people would not be able to replace their assets due to several reasons. It was not possible to replace the assets because there is no similar dormitories in the nearby areas. So it was not possible to replace the asset with a like-for-like alternative structure. Furthermore, the outside facilities have been forbidden by government regulations. So there was no any new apartment building constructed with outdoor facilities such as kitchen, toiletries, etc. So the valuator conducted a detailed, thorough assessment of the market and prepared a well-grounded report to demonstrate that affected people will not be able to buy any apartment with the compensation provided. As a result, there was an additional restoration allowance designed for the project, in the entitlement metrics. And this restoration allowance was calculated as a gap between market value and the cost of a two-bedroom apartment to accommodate the families, in addition to market value as the element of the replacement cost. We will share with you our more detailed case study, two-page case study with details on the case. But here I would like just to outline several learnings from the case related in the context of the replacement cost. To consult affected people on valuation methodology and to engage valuation specialists during that consultations. And we will continue talking about that important milestone. Then during valuation process, you can ask several key questions to determine whether the applied valuation methodology will ensure appropriate compensation for affected residential houses and apartments. You can look at does the valuation approaches use determine market rate or restoration cost of residential houses. If compensation is provided for the lost dwellings, can affected people purchase or construct a replacement dwelling with the compensation paid? Would the replacement dwelling meet acceptable minimum community standards of quality and safety? Are there similar materials in the country, or is there any available similar real estate in the market? And if one of these questions is negative, then it's an imperative to explore other options. You should consult with people, consult with valuation specialists, with other safeguard specialists in the country or international specialists to find the model that will ensure replacement of the affected assets. And valuators are using similar concept, which is called minimum acceptable. So in the safeguards policies, we call it acceptable minimum community standards of quality and safety. In the valuation, there is a similar concept of modern equivalence. And Ben, if you can quickly share with us the idea of the concept, it would be.
Sure. Yes, Zara, with pleasure. Yeah. Again, it's very similar to what you were talking about. It's if there's a building that does not meet the modern regulations, first of all, it would be illegal to rebuild it. So you'd be passing something to the previous owners, which is illegal, which obviously doesn't meet the requirements. And secondly, there's little point in reconstructing buildings which are no longer have an economic life if they may still have a physical life. So the idea of producing a modern equivalent, something which is similar but meets the more modern regulations and laws which exist. And that also actually helps, Zara, if you think about the ESG agenda, the carbon saving construction methods. It would be wrong to perhaps use some of the more traditional construction methods which use increased carbon in their construction. So thinking about all of those things and creating something which is usable, but not necessarily exactly like for like.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. So let's summarize 5 replacement cost elements that we discussed: fair market value, transaction cost, interest, transitional and restoration costs, and other applicable payments. And before we'll move forward with questions and with our next session on challenges of replacement cost, if I may ask Victoria to help me with a small poll.
Thank you, Victoria, very much. So everyone, please look at this poll. And this is just to ensure that, you know, what Zara and Ben have been talking about really stuck. So I see that a lot of you are already responding. I do not, I think, need to read the questions because they're shown on your screen. So Victoria, you tell me when we stop, and then I can read out the results.
Yeah, let's give it maybe another 10 to 15 seconds.
And it's an interesting dynamic, you know, the different competition between the elements. But this is very
Absolutely.
important for us to understand what you want us to concentrate more during these 3 consecutive Mondays.
And it's really interesting to note, Zara, that out of the 5 there's only 1 that uses the word value. So, and we're going to talk a lot about valuation, but then there are the others which are more cost-based, and we'll look at those dynamics of cost against value as we move through the program.
And again, for safeguard specialists, you can see how valuation specialists are framing their messages using different terms that we sometimes are not very sensitive about, but it can result in misunderstanding, which will result in improper valuation. So Victoria, if you can share the results.
Yeah, so the results should be up now.
Okay, so I think most of you responded that fair market value is your top choice of topic you want to be discussed in more detail, closely followed by transitional and restoration costs, and then about an equal percentage, about 7 to 8% for the other 3 that you mentioned: transactional costs, interest accrued, and other applicable payments.
Oh, thank you. Great. Transitional and restoration costs are really challenging ones. But under transactional costs, they are usually questioned about taxes and how taxes should be approached. And let's also discuss it during our 3 days meeting. So over to you, Ines.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we have about 7 minutes left in this session. So I will move on to the Q&A. Thank you, Zara and Ben, for providing a very clear overview of the key definitions crucial for understanding compensation in this topic of involuntary resettlement, focusing on the concept of full replacement cost. So we heard that this includes not only fair market value of the assets, but also incorporates additional financial considerations such as transactional costs, accrued interests, and costs related to transition and restoration, and other payments, of course, ensuring a comprehensive approach to fair compensation. Now, I've already written down some questions. They are mostly related to the actual case study. So as a reminder to everyone, this first session only focused on the key terms. So the next session will expand onto the challenges. And as Zara has mentioned, then based on these polls that we will run throughout the sessions today, we will try to tailor the next 2 Mondays to actually respond a bit more to the topics you find most interesting or challenging. So the first question was, what was the type of title for the residents in the dormitory? Was it a lease or ownership?
It was an ownership.
It was an ownership. So very simple question. In areas where market value is not available, how can we calculate the market value? Maybe this is something for one of the next sessions, because it's a bit more detailed.
We will talk about it next Monday.
Yeah, another very quick, simple one, I think. Does ADB consider compensation in the case of people that are living in illegal facilities, so people without titles?
So
yeah, again, a great. Sorry, Zara, you go.
So ADB and also policies of other banks consider 3 groups eligible for compensation and improvement. So 1 are those who has title, and those should be compensated for all losses, including land, improvements, agricultural losses such as trees, crops. They are eligible for any benefits and allowances under the project. That could be compensation for income losses. There is second group. These are people who doesn't have a title, but they are eligible for the title under the national legislation. And by the way, first group covers not only owners, but also formal renters. So any type of title. So second group are those who doesn't have title, but they can be eligible for a title under the current national legislation. And those should be treated in the same way as the title owners, irrespectively of the formal legalization or registration procedure. In some countries, it's easier to and it's more comfortable for government agencies to implement that clause of the policy after registration of the rights, but it's not required under the policy. So it could be arranged under the project as an implementation arrangement. So second group is eligible for compensation in the same way as the first one. And the third group are those affected people who use the land, who live in the structures, who are getting the income, but they do not have any claims, any title to the land and structures, and whose rights are not recognizable. They cannot register their rights in the country. So this last group, they are eligible for all compensations for improvements, for livelihood restoration programs, for all benefits and allowances, except compensation for land. So the difference between the third group and first two is the limitation in compensation for land. We will add in the presentation on replacement cost one slide on these three groups so that it will provide more clarity in the context of replacement cost. Over to you, Ben.
Sorry, just to add one very quick point, that the international valuation standards made a change 4 years ago, where previously it was not clear that individuals who held land informally, I'm not saying illegally, but informally, could be covered by the international valuation standards. But there were 2 or 3 lines which were added back in 2022, which made it absolutely clear that the international valuation standards recognized informal occupation of land, which then brings the whole legitimacy of the international valuation standards to those affected individuals. So some really important changes within standards, which then allow these individuals to be captured.
Thank you very much. So we have a couple more minutes and some questions. So the next one is about interest accrued. So what would be the ideal percentage to apply? Sorry, is there a gap of time between schedule and actual payment? If there's a gap between schedule and actual payment, do we just consider the interest accrued? How do we factor in the increase in inflation rate? Another one about compensation and delayed timeframes. So is there a time frame that should be identified to cover payment of compensation due to project delays, 5 years or 2 years or more, when land and asset valuation has already been completed? What if the time frame is not explicitly mentioned in the resettlement plan? So I think a couple of questions about interest accrued and delayed payments. So over to you, Ben and Zara.
We are already jumping into the challenges with the replacement costs. So I will also invite my other colleagues to contribute, maybe to take this question now and then continue with challenges of replacement cost. So Ben, if you would like to explore on how inflation could be considered over the time. Yeah, and then we'll invite other colleagues.
Some great questions already coming in, and just shows that some of the challenges which exist around this space because of the time lapse which often occur. Obviously, inflation and interest rate charges are associated, but they are different. And if you believe there's going to be some substantial delay in the compensation being agreed with clients, you may wish to build into your terms of reference a revaluation date. Again, the legislation from the individual country will most likely have absolutely clear dates when payments would be made. So is it when the land is taken from the individual, or is it when the agreement is made? And you need to be absolutely clear when that is. And that will be normally included in the national legislation framework. But then to meet the requirements of ADB and other funding banks, that gap needs to be identified and payments made to make sure that the individual or the family are not unreasonably affected by that delay of being able to receive the money. And also we need to think about how long it might take them not just to receive the money, but how long it might take them to find an alternative property that they would be able to move into, particularly if there's some delays in constructing a new building. So again, we'll come on to the terms of reference, but it's really, really important that you start to think about some of the problems that might occur further down the line, further down the stream, further down the project at the very beginning. And that's always very difficult. But if we can start to think about what delays might mean and think what we do with those challenges, we can build those into the terms of reference. And then the valuer knows that they might be called back to redo valuations. And critically, that can be agreed within the fees.
And we will talk about the terms of references today a little bit later. And please note that on the third day, we will have panel discussions. Those questions that will not be answered today due to time constraints, we will come back to them, we will document them, and we will discuss them with other colleagues here in the room, but also other valuation specialists that will join us during the third day. So with that, I would like to thank you for our first short session, and over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Zara, so much. Yes, so as you said, there are quite a few questions popping up now in the chat that I just cannot read out quickly enough. So it's a mix of questions and challenges, but also some questions on the very basic terms and definitions. So what we can also do after this workshop is we can send out links to ADB's, AIIB's, and NDB's environmental and social frameworks, which will have these definitions, which will have the key some of the responses to some of the key questions that you're asking, which are very basic definitions. So I will not use up the time today for these questions. We will record all of these, sort them according to categories, and then, as Zara said, we will share with the panel, which will be made up of experts on various topics, including today's speakers.